Thank you. Your Honour and Commissioners, today we have Steve Kinman, who's the Deputy Ombudsman in New South Wales, Phil Clark, who's the Queensland Ombudsman, and Deborah Glass, who's the Victorian Ombudsman. Good morning. Perhaps, Mr Kinman, if you'd like to stand for the oath or affirmation. Mr Kinman, who's the Victorian Ombudsman. Good morning. Perhaps, Mr Kinman, if you'd like...
Somewhere nearby.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you could repeat after me, please. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
In this Royal Commission. Thank you. If you could repeat after me, please. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
In this Royal Commission.
In this Royal Commission.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Mr Kinman, if you just replace the Bible, please. And do you wish to take the oath?
The oath, please, Your Honour.
Again, could you raise the Bible, please? And repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
In this Royal Commission.
In this Royal Commission.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but... do we have the Old Testament?
I can't say I know what the Old Testament looks like, Your Honour.
Torah.
Perhaps if Ms Glass has a look at the various books that are there and to see whether one would suit.
Thank you.
Well prepared, Your Honour.
Looks heavy.
So if you repeat after me, please. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
In this Royal Commission.
This Royal Commission.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honour. If I can start with you, Mr Kinman, how long have you been Deputy Ombudsman?
About 10 years.
And your responsibility is particularly for the area that includes out-of-home care.
That's correct.
Now, there are a number of functions that the Ombudsman's Office and you as Deputy Ombudsman have in relation to out-of-home care. And perhaps if we can just deal with the topics for the moment, and we'll come back to the detail. One of the significant areas under your responsibility is reportable conduct matters.
That's correct.
Can you describe what a reportable conduct scheme looks like in your office?
The reportable conduct scheme involves a range of agencies, for example, government and non-government schools, government and non-government out-of-home care providers, private childcare centres, local health districts, and a range of other agencies, notifying the Ombudsman of matters that involve allegations against their employees. And it's important to bear in mind that employees includes those who are engaged to provide services to children.
So contractors?
Yeah, yes, if they're engaged to provide services to children, yes, and engaged by the firm, so yes. It requires the reporting of allegations against employees that are defined as reportable allegations. So if there is an allegation, for example, of a sexual offence, sexual misconduct, an assault, the ill treatment of a child, neglect, or any behaviour that causes psychological harm to a child, if there is an allegation of that type that is made that either alleges that conduct occurred or indeed alleges that it may have occurred, then there's a requirement on the head of the agency, generally the Chief Executive, to, within 30 days, notify the Ombudsman of the allegation.
Does it matter how the Chief Executive Officer came to know about the allegation?
As to whether it needs to be notified?
Yes.
No, it doesn't.
If it is a rumour that something has happened, is that captured by the scheme?
It's very important to bear in mind that it's an allegation-based scheme. So if, for example, the matter may be ultimately be proved to be without foundation, but if the allegation is made, then there's a requirement to report.
So the term allegations used in the legislation?
Yes, yes.
So in the event that there were kids in the playground talking among themselves about don't go near teacher X because, you know, he does terrible things, and a teacher overheard that and reported it to the principal or CEO, would the CEO be obliged to notify you?
Yes, if he receives that information and he believes that it either constitutes an allegation of reportable conduct or that it may involve reportable conduct, then there is a requirement for it to be notified to us.
So it's based on that person's belief that what they've heard constitutes an allegation?
That's right.
And no doubt you would encourage them to take a broad view of allegation?
Indeed.
And is it the case that from time to time you receive information which could, in a common sense term, be classed as rumours?
Yes, that would be correct.
How are they to notify you of this allegation?
There is a requirement that they provide advice to us as to obviously the nature of it. We have a particular form in place which ensures that the information is presented in a systematic fashion. So it'll include basic details which will allow us to assess whether it meets the reportable conduct threshold. In addition, there's information that we receive in terms of the characteristics of the victim and information also in relation to the person, the subject of allegation. And so we have a form in place which is easily accessible on our website, and so that provides guidance to agencies.
If a CEO doesn't know the name of the purported victim and doesn't have a name of the alleged perpetrator, are they still to report?
Well, that's not an allegation against an employee. However, by virtue of our broader jurisdiction and by virtue of the fact that agencies are very aware that we're willing to help and assist, if they had a matter which wasn't fully formed, but they had concerns about it, then we would encourage them to make contact with us.
Mm-hmm. So if, as has often been the case that the Royal Commission has heard, a child can't identify the name of a person because they all look the same, and if the information that was overheard was a group of children talking about not wanting to do something because of what they had heard others had experienced, you would not have a perpetrator or a victim named. Would that fall within the definition, bearing in mind that it must have been an employee by the nature of the circumstances of the discussion?
I think, Councillor, I would take the view that the legal question as to whether it's sufficiently identified an employee is one thing. The benefit of a matter of that type coming to our organisation in order for us to review it and to provide practical assistance in relation to how it might be moved forward, together with the risk management strategies that might be in place. Our particular view is, once again, given this is about protecting children, the preference would be for them to notify us for the purpose then of having a look at what could be done with the matter.
Thank you. Now, in addition to the reportable conduct jurisdiction, you have the capacity to investigate of your own motion or at your own initiative?
That's correct.
Is there a provision in your legislation that you can be directed by Minister or Parliament to undertake a particular investigation?
No, I think it's very important for me to note that we are independent of government.
I understand that, but nevertheless, can you be directed to undertake any investigation?
No.
You have a parliamentary committee as an oversight mechanism?
That's correct.
Any other?
No.
You also, as I understand it, undertake auditing work?
That's correct. In addition, under our legislation, it refers to the importance of the Ombudsman, in addition to dealing with individual matters and ensuring that they're appropriately handled, the responsibility of our office to keep under scrutiny the systems for the reporting of matters. That includes the systems for preventing reportable conduct and for reporting and responding to reportable conduct. And so we carry out that function via a range of auditing activities, but in addition, the use of, for example, the use of consultations and also review of data is critical in terms of us monitoring the health of the system, monitoring reporting trends, and making decisions about where we might need to apply our resources because of potential vulnerabilities in terms of the operation of the scheme.
And you have a broader responsibility and function to receive complaints that fall outside of the reportable conduct scheme against government agencies?
Yes, against both government and non-government agencies. So I have a dual function of Deputy Ombudsman and Community and Disability Services Commissioner. And there are 8 functions pertaining to my role as Community and Disability Services Commissioner. I won't take you through each of them, but it's important to bear in mind that I have a broad monitoring, review and inquiry role in connection with principally children's services, and that includes the out-of-home care sector, the early intervention sector, in connection with principally children's services, and that includes the out-of-home care. And so there is an ongoing responsibility that we have to look at the health of those systems, and it's the strategic use of that function combined with the reportable conduct function that assists us in terms of identifying issues that need to be pursued and achieving outcomes.
So I take it that the data you collect under the reportable conduct scheme can be married up with the data under your broader complaint handling responsibilities, including the disability matters you referred to, so as to gain one picture.
Absolutely, and complaint data is very important, but in addition to that, we facilitate the operation of the Community Visitor Scheme. The Visitor Scheme involves visits to both disability services, but in addition to that, this Visitor Scheme operates in relation to children who are in residential out-of-home care. And so that's another important source of information. We have a child death review function, which once again is another important source of information. So there's the complaints function, the community visiting function, the reportable conduct function. We have a community education function. And one thing that we find is absolutely vital is it's important not to carry out one's functions simply sitting within the office. It's essential that one builds good relationships with those who are most important in relation to service delivery, namely the service providers themselves. And so we invest quite heavily in terms of ensuring that we have good business relationships with and good connections with those people who are at the coalface doing the very important work of serving people with disabilities and serving children. And of course, for the purposes of this hearing, children in that includes children in out-of-home care.
With the official visitors scheme, has that always been under the Ombudsman's umbrella?
The visiting scheme was a part of the Community Services Commission, which was the functions of the Community Services Commission were rolled into the Ombudsman's office early this century. And it sounds like a long time ago.
So about a decade or so ago.
About a decade, a little bit over a decade ago. And so the visiting scheme was a part of the Community Services Commission, and it's an invaluable source of information. And I think it's a very important safeguard for children in out-of-home care, as well as people with disabilities living in disability accommodation environments.
Just concentrating on children in out-of-home care in residential facilities. How has the operation of the visitor scheme changed from when you were involved with it about a decade ago to today?
I think a number of things. We, for example, have done some work around this critical issue of data, and so we engaged a number of years ago Roger West's firm from Westwood Spice to look at aligning the information that visitors capture with various standards in the disability area and in the out-of-home care area, so that there was a much more systematic collection of information holdings. We've introduced a very strong mentoring scheme for new visitors, so that they feel supported and they get the very solid advice from experienced visitors about visiting. A great deal of investment also in the area of education for visitors, a lot of training, so that we're providing support to them. So there are many elements, because the Commission did a good job in my opinion. There are many elements of the visiting scheme that are the same as the operation under the Commission. But as one would expect, in the last 10 years, we've looked to continue to improve the operation of that scheme.
Are they volunteers?
No, the remuneration is not. It's not a situation where the remuneration levels are high. They're a little bit over $30 an hour, and for $30 an hour, we have the benefit of attracting a whole range of people with exceptional skills, and so it's often, but not always, a situation where you can have a very experienced person who's worked in the community services area. They are either towards the end of their career or they've retired, and this is something they'd like to do by way of giving back to the community.
Do you have a benchmark as to how frequently community visitors should visit children in out-of-home care and residential facilities?
I could give you information on that. I have a couple of staff who it's not simply a situation where we leave it up to the visitors. So we will allocate visits to visitors with expectations as to the number of visits, but I don't have those details at the ready. But I'm happy to provide that to the Commission.
Does that suggest that there's not a set period of time or frequency? It depends upon the nature of the child and the nature of the facility?
It's a combination of that there are certain parameters, and so we send out a visiting schedule. The visitors are aware of which particular services they're required to visit under that schedule, and there's an expectation as to a certain level of frequency of visits. But we've made it very, very clear to visitors that if they have information that indicates that a particular service needs to receive additional visits, then we're very keen for them to conduct additional visits. And so we build within the budget a significant amount of leeway so that visitors who have concerns about particular services can invest heavily in more visiting in those services.
Thank you. Mr Clark, can I turn to you? How long have you been the Queensland Ombudsman?
About 4.5 years, Councillor.
But the office has been there for some significant time.
41 years the Ombudsman has existed in Queensland.
What are your functions in relation to children in out-of-home care in Queensland?
Broadly, they are the functions of the Parliamentary Ombudsman. I have no particular child safety responsibilities. After the recent inquiry undertaken by Honourable Justice Carmody, the changes that were made to the system gave me a role in enhanced complaints oversight, which was formerly the responsibility of the Children's Commission. It's existed until the middle of last year. But other than that, my responsibilities in child safety are broadly those that relate to a normal ombudsman, parliamentary ombudsman jurisdiction. I can look at complaints, I can receive complaints, I can investigate complaints, I can refer complaints, I can undertake matters under my own initiative. and I can put in place administrative improvement arrangements with agencies if I believe that is necessary. For example, immediately prior to adopting the new system in Queensland, we undertook an audit of the Department of Communities, Child Safety and Disability Services complaints management process. So we did that in preparation for the new system commencing and made some recommendations to them about that.
Does your complaint handling capacity extend to the non-government sector?
It can. There's a particular section under my Act, under Section 10C, which allows me to undertake certain complaints management and investigations related to bodies that perform a function on behalf of government. There are limits to that. There are legal limits to it, and there are practical limits to it. But there is some capacity for me to do that work. Have
you exercised that function in respect of children in out-of-home care?
No, I haven't.
How long have you had that capacity?
It's been in the Act. Certainly, it's in the current legislation. I can't absolutely indicate that it was in the previous legislation, but at least since 2000.
Does anyone else in Queensland have a responsibility to receive and deal with complaints about children in out-of-home care?
The department would be the principal mechanism for receiving complaints about out-of-home care.
Is the department required to cooperate with you, forward to you, or otherwise inform you of complaints?
No, there's no structured arrangement that requires that to occur.
Does it happen?
Matters may come to my attention if a person is dissatisfied with the handling by the department. They will bring the matter to my attention, and then I will make a decision about it.
But that would be a complaint about how the department handled a complaint?
It would be a complaint about the department, yes, but it's also extremely likely to include the content of the originating complaint.
So it's possible, is it, that a complainant would report both to the department and to you about an event in relation to a child in out-of-home care, and there'd be no requirement for each of you to exchange that information with the other?
There's no requirement in legislation. As a matter of policy in my office, we, as part of determining what action we will take, we seek from the complainant the history of that complaint. In other words, have they dealt with the agency? Have they not dealt with the agency? That's a standard practice in the office. So we are very likely, unless the complainant misleads us, to become aware of that through that process.
Having become aware of it, what do you do?
If the matter has been dealt with by the department through its full complaints process, we will then assess it for whether we would choose to take any further action. So we'd look at the handling of it by the department. If we deem that handling to be fair and reasonable, comprehensive, then we may in fact decline to take it any further. If we determine that there's some deficiency in the department's handling of it, then we would refer it in-house for investigation and consider the matter with that through our own normal processes.
The answer you've given assumes that your involvement is to scrutinise the handling of the complaint by the department rather than the department's conduct that may have given a rise to the complaint.
The content of the complaint is contained within that. Yes, we do look at the process. That is a substantial part of what we do. If we determine that the department's analysis, whether they've comprehensively dealt with the evidence, provided natural justice to any party involved, etc., they are important elements to the overall investigation. But they're not the limits of the investigation. The evidence provided natural justice to any party involved, etc. They are important, right, and included in and make an alternative decision in regard to the content of the complaint in its own right.
Do you keep data on complaints received about children in out-of-home care?
We keep data in regard to complaints received about the department. That's broken down. I can provide the information. I don't have it to hand at the moment, but that would include complaints about children in out-of-home care.
What about children in the care of a non-government organisation by way of a contract to the department?
If it is done through a contract to the department, I believe Section 10C of my Act would allow me to look at that, yes. If it comes to my attention, I don't. And that's an important discrimination, I think, between the New South Wales system and the Queensland system. Matters have to come to my attention for me to deal with them.
Why is that a difference between New South Wales?
Well, the reportable conduct scheme, I think, the practical application of the reportable conduct scheme is somewhat of a pull model, that matters are pulled to the Ombudsman's attention, whereas in Queensland circumstance, unless a complaint is made or a matter comes to my attention by some other process, then I'm unlikely to be aware of that.
So what you're saying is no one's required to make a complaint to you or tell you of an allegation?
That's exactly right.
Has there been any consideration given in Queensland to a scheme similar to the reportable conduct scheme?
I haven't participated in any discussions about it, no.
What do you think?
I think it would be a very positive addition to the operation of the system in Queensland. What I know of the New South Wales system is that it adds a level of it creates a comprehensive oversight framework, which is perhaps its greatest feature. The linkages between reportable conduct and working with children, certification processes, I think, are important ones. And I think the working with children arrangements in Queensland could be strengthened with a reportable conduct regime. I have to say I would not necessarily be convinced that my office would be the place to put it. Because of the other structures that exist, it would be a matter of determining best place for it. But in the absence of any other position, certainly my office could undertake that function, and I think it would add value.
The Royal Commission heard yesterday from two officers who work in areas relevant to the safety of children. Would either of those officers be appropriate, do you think, to house that function?
We've had some preliminary discussions between the Family and Child Commissioner and the Public Guardian and myself. I think the most reasonable alternative would be the Public Guardian's office, but there are some issues with advocacy, being able to undertake individual advocacy on behalf of children and be the guardian of a reportable conduct scheme. I think there is an inherent conflict in that space. There are also some inherent conflicts in an ombudsman oversighting these things. Being a part of a regulatory regime and then being able to receive complaints about the outcomes of that regulatory regime also has some inherent conflicts in it. But I think they would be manageable with reasonable approaches.
Did the Carmody inquiry comment on the benefits or otherwise of a reportable conduct scheme?
I don't recall that being commented on, no.
Just returning to data, you say that your office has the breakdown of complaints received about the department. Do those figures break down further into sexual assault or other matters in out-of-home care?
We can do that. It requires an analysis at the individual file level. So the data capture processes don't do it, but I can do that work, yes.
So what do the data processes capture without
Broad categorisations of complaints are generally captured in the data.
Tell me what that means.
Well, for example, in 2014-15 year, which is just completed, the categorisation would be child protection intervention, officer conduct, child protection intake, foster or kinship care, child protection investigation and assessment. They are the categories that we use to collect data.
So they're the categories of the institution or agency with respect to which the complaint's been made. What about the nature of the complaint made?
The nature of the complaint requires a file assessment in my office. So we would drill down into a complaint, say if it was, for example, about foster or kinship care, we would then look at those files to determine the nature of the complaint and whether it involved, for example, sexual misconduct or abuse or some other form of inappropriate behaviour. Has
consideration been given to expanding the categories of data you collect electronically?
It's a case in terms of the volume. Last year we had, for the child safety department, in regard to child safety matters, 334 complaints. So there is not a vast volume of complaints. So being able to break them down into further categories probably just means those categories have fewer numbers of complaints in them. For example, yesterday you asked one of the other witnesses about whether they'd referred matters to the police service as part of their functioning. Last night I was able to get a question of my officers as to whether we'd referred any matters to the police in the last 12 months. So they could look at the whole 334 files in a couple of hours.
But you didn't think to ask them about the child sexual assault allegations?
I asked them specifically about child sexual abuse allegations and whether we'd referred them. We had, in fact, about 24 matters out of the 334 that could be categorised as having some element of child abuse associated with it, sexual abuse associated with it, and of those 24 matters, we were able to conduct that analysis quite quickly from the files that we have, the file information that we have.
So that's 24 complaints out of 300 odd against the department, and the complaints were specifically about some form of sexual conduct in out-of-home care.
They had some. It may not have been in out-of-home care. It may have been in other circumstances. But yes, there were about 24 matters. I don't recall the exact number at the moment. It's about 24 matters.
You weren't told of those 24 matters how many were in out-of-home care?
I didn't collect that information, no. I can collect it, and I'm happy to provide it to the Commission, but I don't have it to hand.
We'd appreciate if you would. It doesn't seem that it would be an onerous task given you're looking at 24 files.
No, it won't be an onerous task.
Would there be any other department through which a complaint may be made that would be an allegation of sexual assault against a child in out-of-home care?
Through the department itself, the Department of Community Child Safety and Disability Services, and through the public guardian role as an advocate and through the visiting program.
In terms of the data you have that would enable the Royal Commission to have an understanding of allegations about child sexual assault in out-of-home care, you have spoken of the department being your main source, and that's the Department of Communities and
Child Safety, yes, and Disability Services.
Is there any other department in Queensland that you would expect that would receive allegations of the sort we're discussing?
The Department of Education could certainly receive allegations, and there's mandatory reporting arrangements that do apply in the department. Department of Health also is likely to generate those sorts of complaints and information. And there's mandatory reporting arrangements for medical practitioners and nurses which are in place.
But the mandatory reporting notifications go direct to the department.
That's correct.
They're not complaints, as it were.
That's correct.
In terms of education and health, do you inquire into the complaint handling of each of those in respect of complaints about out-of-home care?
Not in recent history. We can do it. If a complaint comes to my attention, we will go through our processes of determining whether we would investigate it further. And we do undertake work in terms of administrative improvement around complaints handling in agencies in a general sense, but not specific to out-of-home care and not specific to child sexual abuse.
I take it from your description of the data you keep that you would not be able to indicate trends in the area of interest to this Royal Commission at all?
Not at this point in time. I can provide the Commission with my office's historical information about child safety complaints and could break them down to quite a significant level in terms of the content of those complaints. But during the term of the Children's Commission until 12 months ago, most of that information would have been held in the Children's Commission, and we'd have to do historical archival work with the records from the Children's Commission to be able to provide that. Those records currently sit with the Public Guardian's office.
And you have access to them, I take it?
I can access them, yes.
So currently, you'd have to go to another agency to enable you to understand historic trends in an area that's now within your function.
I would for anything before 1st of July last year, 2014. From now on, I can and intend to observe or put in place a process for doing an annual review of complaints about child safety matters, since it's now a more significant part of my normal responsibilities. But yes, prior to that, I would have had to go on to the Children's Commission, and will now have to access those records through the Public Guardian's Office if I choose to.
How effective do you think are the mechanisms currently for protecting children in out-of-home care being split between you and two other agencies?
The roles and responsibilities...
3 other
agencies, yes.
3.
The responsibilities that the Public Guardian has in regard to advocacy, visiting and child guardianship are quite specific, and in my view, the powers that exist for the Public Guardian are comprehensive in terms of questioning persons involved with the child, being able to demand records, etc., from organisations that provide services to children. So they have quite a comprehensive framework to work within. The work of the Commission, the Family and Child Commission, is at very early stages, so it's really difficult for me to make a decision about the effectiveness of that work. We will cooperate with the Commission to support its functioning, but at this early stage it is a very early conversation. The department has a long history. There have been identified failings over time, and indeed the Carmody Inquiry, made a number of recommendations about particularly the degree to which the department engages with children, the effectiveness of the complaints management process in the department, and the degree to which children use that complaints management process was significantly commented on by the inquiry. And indeed, in the last 12 months, we've been working with the department. I have officers who are involved in the working party about improving that complaints handling process within the department. So I'm optimistic that the system can work well, but with the current arrangements for the Family and Child Commission in particular, it's just very early on to be able to determine whether that oversight function is effective. Perhaps the most significant element of it is the reporting element, and then close behind that would be the workforce element. The Family and Child Commission has a particular responsibility in oversighting the workforce in child safety and being able to make recommendations about the degree to which the workforce meets its obligations.
How would you best describe the way you work that contributes to preventing child sexual abuse in out-of-home care?
As I said in my opening comments, my role is a very traditional parliamentary ombudsman role. The degree to which we are able to, in a very timely way, refer matters to the department, which is the usual place for us to refer matters, and then to take our own assessments and investigations of matters that we deem have been unsatisfactorily dealt with is the greatest contribution I think that we can make at this point in time. Apart from the not new function, but the emphasis that we now place upon oversight and complaints management. So complaints are a very, very important source of information about the effective operation of the system. And while it is early in the operation of the new arrangements in Queensland, if I can call them the new arrangements in Queensland, I'm again optimistic that that will be made to work effectively.
You say that complaints are a very, very important source of information, but the source of information is only as good as the data that you seek to collect electronically from those complaints. Isn't that right?
Yes, I agree with that.
And can I suggest that your description of the extent to which you collect data indicates it's at a very low level?
As I said, we received last financial year 334 complaints, and we were able to analyse those complaints very quickly for a specific question. The ongoing analysis of those complaints is yet to be done in my office for the effectiveness of last year.
Just leaving aside the analysis for the moment, which required you to go to the files, as you've said, you currently collect the institution from which or about which the complaint is made. You don't collect anything about the nature of the complaint.
Well, I think the categorisation is more about nature of complaint than it is about institution. So if I, for example, foster and kinship care, while it is the nature of that, it is a foster or kinship care complaint. It's not about a particular body. Now, whether that flows to a particular body is about the structure that underpins foster and kinship caring in our state.
Foster and kinship care is a method of delivering out-of-home care services. So it's the institution in which the complaint's made. It doesn't tell you anything about the complaint itself, does it?
It doesn't tell me about the content of the complaint, no. It doesn't tell me whether it is about sexual abuse or whether it's about other abuse or whether it's about some other aspect of kinship care. That is true.
Wouldn't that be, at the very least, useful in you determining how best to use your resources to improve areas under your jurisdiction?
That may flow from my analysis of the complaint from last year. The current system is the historic system that's been in the office for quite a long time, and it has existed during the period of time when there was a Children's Commission in Queensland. And the Children's Commission had a much more comprehensive role in terms of the protection of children than my office does now or did then. So whether I change those categorisations will depend upon the analysis I do of the complaints received in each subsequent year. It's quite possible that they will change, and from time to time we do change them right across the whole spectrum of my jurisdiction. But at the moment, that's the historical context that I have. As I said, the number of complaints is relatively small and is conducive to quite a detailed analysis in any given 12-month period.
By going to the files?
By going to the files.
Mr. Clark, can I just clarify something? In response to a question by Ms. Furness, two things. You indicated you've got these enhanced complaint handling mechanisms since the Carmody report. Does that mean that you have an oversight of the department's complaint handling processes? Are you the agency, at the end of the day, that will oversight those complaint handling processes?
Commissioner, I think it's a statement of fact that I've always had an opportunity to do that work, but what Carmody inquiry brought through its recommendations was that I should focus on complaints handling systems and processes. That is what I intend to do.
And when you also, in response to a question from Ms. Furness, indicated you're now going to do a 12-monthly or an annual review. Am I correct in understanding that is a systemic review of the efficiency and effectiveness of the complaint handling process, including that of the department? Is that the correct position?
That is true. It being the first year in which this new arrangement has been in place, I've done a very broad just collection of numbers in the last couple of days. But I do intend to look at the effectiveness and efficiency of the complaints handling system in the department, the Public Guardian's office, and indeed in my own office.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Glass, how long have you been the Victorian Ombudsman?
About 15 months.
What did you do before that?
I was Deputy Chair of the Independent Police Complaints Commission of England and Wales.
Hence the accent.
Indeed.
What are the functions of the Ombudsman in relation to children in out-of-home care in Victoria?
Unlike my colleague in New South Wales, I have no specific functions in this area. I am essentially a traditional parliamentary ombudsman. So I have a broad jurisdiction over some 1,000 government departments and agencies. I deal with traditional complaints handling functions, and I have the traditional powers of the Ombudsman around launching own motion investigations into systemic issues.
In the period of time that you've been Ombudsman, have you done any particular work in relation to out-of-home care?
I haven't. This was an area covered in some detail by my predecessor, who did quite a bit of work in it. And I'm obviously was looking into areas that had not been covered quite so recently.
What has he done more recently?
Well, if I can, I'm happy to give you a sort of brief overview of the investigations he looked into. I will keep it very brief. I mean, he did an own motion investigation to child protection in 2009. He followed that with a own motion investigation to out-of-home care in 2010. There were a number of subsequent investigations into failures of agencies to manage registered sex offenders in 2011.
I'm sorry, can you just say that again a bit more slowly?
He carried out an investigation to the failure of agencies to manage registered sex offenders in February 2011. There was an investigation also in that year into child protection in a particular region of Victoria. And all of these fed into a number of parliamentary inquiries that subsequently took place, including a substantial report into protecting Victoria's vulnerable children, which was a parliamentary inquiry reporting in January 2012, and another inquiry in late 2013 by the Family and Community Development Committee. So there has been quite a bit of attention in this area in the state of Victoria. Various Auditor General reports as well. I've no doubt they're all on the public record.
Do you consider that you have any function in relation to monitoring whether recommendations made by your office, albeit your predecessor, have been implemented?
My office certainly reviews whether recommendations made have been implemented, and we do that. In fact, of the recommendations made by my predecessor, almost all of them were accepted. What we haven't done, and I don't think you can do without actually launching a fresh investigation, is to determine whether they're effective.
Well, there's one thing to be accepted, there's another thing to be effective, but in the middle is being implemented.
Well, the reports back are that they're implemented. Now, things change, of course, over the period, and the system now is different from the one that my predecessor was investigating in 2009. You know, I think to look at the effectiveness of the system, you'd have to launch a fresh own motion investigation.
I understand in relation to the effectiveness of the changes, but reports come to you about whether or not, probably subjectively by the agency, they have implemented the recommendations. Is that right?
Well, they will report that they have implemented them, yes.
Do you have any concerns now, bearing in mind you've only been in the position for 15 months, about the area of children in out-of-home care based on what you know about what has or hasn't been implemented?
I think it's difficult to make an assessment without actually carrying out an investigation yourself. I mean, there's clearly been a lot of work in this area. I have an overall impression, I have to say, from having looked at reports and reviews, that this is, and I've recently completed an investigation into disability, of oversight of the disability sector.
I'm sorry, the what side?
The effectiveness of oversight in the disability sector, a report I tabled last week. But there is something of an impression that I have of this that mirrors the impression the evidence, in fact, that I had in that one, that this is an area where there are significant numbers of reports that result in reviews which confirm the existence of the problem.
What problem's that?
Well, that there is a problem in the area which don't necessarily result in effective change.
How would you describe that problem from the work that you've done or the observations you've made?
Well, again, it's not the work that I've done. It's work that has been done. You see a succession of reports that will say that the system is not working. What is the solution to this? You see a succession of recommendations which you see being implemented. But that results in a further report and a further review and a further set of recommendations.
And the system you're describing is the out-of-home care system?
Well, the reports that I've described are much broader than that. You know, they've looked at the whole range of child protection mechanisms, the issues affecting vulnerable children, but that includes out-of-home care.
Now, you clearly don't have a reportable conduct function that is in existence in New South Wales. Has that been an issue that's come to your attention in the last 15 months?
It hasn't, but there were. But if I may draw your attention to the recommendation of the Family and Community Development Committee in November 2013, it actually recommend that the Victorian Government authorise an independent statutory body with relevant investigatory powers and legal and operational resources to oversee and monitor the handling of allegations of child abuse and undertake independent investigations into systems and processes. And I think their intention was to recommend that Victoria mirror the New South Wales scheme. I did actually ask for an update on what had happened in response to that. Understand that the previous government intended to legislate for this function to be given to the Children's Commission. As far as I understand, it certainly hasn't happened yet, but that's obviously a question that would need to be put to the government.
Do you have a view as to whether it would assist in protecting children in out-of-home care in New South Wales to have such a system?
I have no doubt that mandatory reporting and greater degree of oversight would assist.
By mandatory reporting, you mean reporting matters such as Mr Kinman's described to a statutory body?
Yes, yes. I mean, that was... Again, there are parallels here with disability abuse, and the key recommendation that I've made in that investigation is that there be a single oversight body that receives mandatory reports of abuse.
The Commissioner for Children and Young Persons gave evidence yesterday. Were you here when Mr Geary gave evidence?
I wasn't, no.
Are you aware generally of the evidence he gave?
Well, I did hear some of it, and I'm aware that he gave evidence that his office received some hundreds of complaints of abuse.
Yes, he said that he didn't have any legislative power with respect to those complaints, but he nevertheless received them. I think he indicated that generally he passed them on to your organisation?
He doesn't, no. I haven't received any complaints that I'm aware of from the Commissioner for Children and Young People.
Would you expect to?
I would, yes.
Your expectation would be on the basis that if he received them and he was not the primary complaint handling body, he'd hand them to you.
Well, I expect him to do the appropriate thing with them. It obviously depends on the nature of the complaint. Some could be dealt with by departments directly, but I would expect that a significant allegation would be referred to the Ombudsman, because I have a complaint handling responsibility and I have the powers and functions to deal with complaints.
Are you the only agency in Victoria that has the legislative responsibility to handle complaints of child sexual abuse and out-of-home care?
Well, the police would be the principal agency to deal with this. I mean, obviously it depends on the nature of the allegation.
Well, by complaints, I'm referring to of an administrative nature rather than a person going to the police to provide information that a crime had been committed.
Yes, I would be.
You would be? Is that a function that you've discussed with the Commissioner?
Well, there have been discussions that there should be more of an information flow between our offices. I mean, I think in an ideal world, what you would expect to see would be any specific complaints that came into the Commissioner's office that he clearly doesn't have the powers to deal with would be referred to my office. And similarly, I would expect to be providing sort of systemic... I mean, he's got a monitoring role, which is very important. I mean, the preventative role doesn't sit with my office, it sits with his. But I would expect that I would be able to provide de-identified trends, information that will allow him to fulfil his functions.
Did you have any involvement, or your office have any involvement into his recent but yet to be completed inquiry into residential care?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Do you know whether your office provided any information, given your complaint handling responsibility?
We actually get very few complaints. Almost none. I mean, we do get some hundreds of complaints broadly in the child protection area. And I've asked for some information around how much of that would involve abuse. The information I got back is that the numbers are minimal. So we simply don't get the information.
So you don't receive any significant numbers of complaints about children in out-of-home care, is that right?
Not at present, no.
Is that something you think is reflective of the conduct of people in out-of-home care or it says more about the level of reporting or complaining?
I think it's difficult to say. I mean, I reflect on this anyway, coming new into the role. I mean, how do you determine that people in the state of Victoria know they can complain to their ombudsman and what they can complain about? So, I've embarked on a much broader programme of engagement with the public and with community organisations, with third-party advocates and the like, but it's very early stages. Because I think there is a much broader piece of work about people understanding what the Ombudsman does.
Did your predecessor engage in a community education program that you're aware of?
No, he didn't.
So you don't have any basis for, at this stage, indicating whether such a program has been in the past successful in increasing complaint rates?
No, I mean, clearly an Ombudsman's office, and I include my predecessor, and it always does a certain amount of this. They do what they can, but the reality is, as a parliamentary ombudsman, and I'm sure I speak along with my colleagues both in Australia and across around the world. We inevitably run minimally resourced and, dare I say, unloved offices in public sector terms, where you're constantly having to juggle your resources and identify the issues that you should be focusing on.
Do you have jurisdiction over the Public Guardian and the Commissioner?
I do, yes.
So if complaints could be made to you about them?
They could be.
Has that happened?
Occasionally, not something that crops up as a major theme that would then, attract your attention as a potential subject of a future investigation.
Does your office operate any community visitors program?
My office doesn't, no. There is a community visitors program that is run by the Office of the Public Advocate.
Do you have any view as to where such a function should sit?
I've looked at this in the context of disability. I can't comment in relation to the child abuse area. Certainly with disability, the public advocate scheme seems to be very effective. They do good work. I've been both complimentary of it and slightly critical of it in my last report. And the criticism is only around that they will sometimes cling on to things, rather than because they're passionate about them and concerned about them. So they'll receive reports of abuse that they could very helpfully send to my office, but they try and resolve them themselves, which is not necessarily the best outcome.
And that's a question of educating or training the visitors as to what you consider their role
It is,
to be.
yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I come back to you, Mr. Kinman, about data? Now, I understand that you've put together some data to assist us, and some of the language that you use, which of course suits your purpose, is somewhat less clear for our purpose. Perhaps if I can ask you to indicate, in whatever period of time you choose, how many allegations you have received, or notifications as you described them, in relation to sexual misconduct or a sexual offence in out-of-home care.
Yes, so a notification relates to a reportable conduct matter that is sent to our office under the legislation. So if one looks, for example, at the 2013-2014 period, in terms of sexual misconduct in the non-out-of-home care environment, 191. In the out-of-home care environment, 63. Sexual offences in the non-out-of-home care environment, and these are closed matters, 39. In the out-of-home care environment, 28. And so we have a situation of sexual misconduct in the non-out-of-home care environment, for example, sits at 38% of all complaints. In the out-of-home care environment, 14%. Sexual offence allegations, 8% in the non-out-of-home care environment, and 6% in the out-of-home care environment.
Well, firstly, can I ask you what you mean by closed?
These are cases that have been finished.
What does that tell you about the preponderance of those allegations in out-of-home care compared with non-out-of-home care?
Well, the major contributor to sexual misconduct and sexual offence matters being, in percentage terms, larger in the non-out-of-home care environment is the fact of that it's quite high in the education sector, and the education sector is a major reporter.
So let's just go back to that. There's 38% of all notifications about sexual misconduct come from the non-out-of-home care sector.
That's correct.
And 14% come from the out-of-home care sector.
That's right.
Now, if you can help us with the relative size of each of those sectors and indicate your observation as to what those figures mean, given the relative size.
In terms of well, obviously the education sector is a very large sector with a large number of employees, and in terms of its impact on the reportable conduct scheme, it represents a very large percentage of the reportable conduct matters. But if you combine the out-of-home care sector and the education sector, it's somewhere between about 85 to 95% of matters that come in, and so very large numbers of sexual misconduct, sexual offence matters in the education sector are going to push the issues up in terms of the percentage of matters that are sexual misconduct and sexual offence. And so, for example, and this is also reflected in the charges, 122 current open matters. By an open matter, it hasn't been finalised. 122 open matters, of which have been charged. 70 of the 122.
Sorry, let me just stop you there. When you say has been charged, are you referring to an individual having been charged with a sexual offence in respect of all agencies who provide notifications?
The charging relates to one or more offence of any kind, and then to break that down, so of 122 individuals who've been charged, we have 70 of those, 57% of all the charges are from the education sector. So I think that illustrates the extent to which the education sector plays a major part of the overall mix in the reportable conduct area. But 62 of the 70 who were charged from the education sector were charged with sexual offences. Now,
that's very high.
It is very high. If we look at the out-of-home care sector, so we have 122 people who've been charged overall. 30 of those who've been charged with one or more offences are from the out-of-home care sector. So that represents 24% of the total number of charges.
Just let me stop you there. This is information that the police have provided to you or you've obtained from cops as to people being charged arising from notifications or in relation to notifications or entirely separate from notifications?
These are matters that are inextricably linked with notifications, and in a number of these cases, and in fact we recently did an assessment of matters that have been charged, and in a significant number of cases, very significant number, we've played a role, for example, whether it be by way of risk management action, whether it be by way of a requirement for further investigative steps to be taken by the agency, or in certain cases it's a matter of pulling together holdings from the child protection system, information system, from the police information system, providing information to the police, which have assisted them in relation to their investigation.
Let me just go back then to the 38% and 14% of sexual misconduct in non-out-of-home care and out-of-home care. What conclusions do you draw from that in order for you to properly direct your resources in looking at systemic issues in out-of-home care?
Well, look, the figures don't surprise me, because if one thinks about the issue of sexual misconduct and sexual offences in an out-of-home care setting, the difficulty is that setting, given that most of these placements are foster care placements, is quite an intimate setting. And there is an enormous challenge in the out-of-home care environment in terms of ensuring that these types of matters, that we've got the best systems in place to ensure that these types of matters come to light. Now, obviously, if we have a child who is vulnerable and of course many children in out-of-home care are very vulnerable, then we need to have the best systems in place in terms of seeking to encourage and seeking to, where matters come to light, and sometimes you might not have a fully fledged allegation, to act on those cases. In the education sector, of course, it's a very different context. The behaviour is less intimate, it's much more open, and breaches of codes of conduct are going to be more obvious. And so it does not surprise me that the sexual misconduct, sexual offence percentages are higher in the, as a proportion of notifications in the education sector as compared to the out-of-home care sector.
Which is not necessarily a reflection of what happens in those sector. It's only a reflection of the notifications you receive.
Indeed, indeed. But can I make another point too? The benefit of a mandatory system for notifying these matters is there's a cultural element to that. I mean, it sends a very clear message that this sort of behaviour is unacceptable, and it needs to be not swept under the carpet. It needs to be to see the light of day. Now, if one was to rely on a complaint system, on the other hand, and for example, to a complaint system to our organisation, our data tells us that in terms of complaints which are about people who are victims of abuse, the complaint system is not a particularly good indicator at all, because that requires, quite frankly, either the child or someone on their behalf to have the confidence to bring the matter forward to an ombudsman's office. I think, quite frankly, if we're talking about cultural change, to put the responsibility on the organisation to be vigilant in terms of identifying this type of behaviour, and for there to be some openness and transparency. I think that's the great benefit, for it not to be dealt then in-house within the organisation, but then for an external player to have a look at how those matters are dealt with, is essential in this area.
And that's the policy underpinning your reportable conduct function, isn't it?
Absolutely. And then the next question is, well, could not that process be carried out by a government department? And my argument would be, well, government departments do not have the same level of independence. They certainly don't have the powers. They don't have the access to information. They don't, for example, no other government agency in New South Wales, to my knowledge, has both access to the police information systems and the child protection information systems.
They're cops and kids you're referring to.
Cops and kids. And so there's a lack of openness and transparency about it. And in addition, there's no other government agency in New South Wales that has the jurisdictional reach. And that reach includes, and is absolutely essential, that reach includes a strong interface with the police.
There's no suggestion, is there, in New South Wales that the function would be removed from you to somewhere else?
None that I'm aware of. Can I also say that the 3rd of December last year, and this perhaps reflects the view of government, but not only the view of government, but the view of Parliament in New South Wales, the reportable disability incident scheme commenced in New South Wales, and that involves the mandatory reporting of abuse and neglect and ill treatment matters, and also, interestingly enough, serious unexplained injuries in a disability context. And in addition, it requires, which is different than the reportable conduct scheme, it also requires serious client-to-client abuse matters to be reported. Now, since the 3rd of December, the number of reports are averaging a little bit over 50 a month. And of interest is
that higher or lower than you'd expect?
It's about 50% above what we estimated. And the matters, yes, I've got to say, we're not dealing with trivial matters. No. So, for example, the client-to-client matters that we're receiving have to meet the criteria of serious fractures, right, bruises, obviously sexual assault, or matters where there is an ongoing pattern of physical abuse. So many of these matters, if they concern children, would be notified to the Child Abuse Squad. In fact, we use that as a bit of a guide. But notwithstanding that, the reports are significant, and as the point I made earlier is it's a slightly different scheme than the reportable conduct scheme because there is line of sight in relation to serious client-on-client abuse matters.
So this scheme relates to people with a disability in a state-run facility?
It relates to people with this disability who are in funded disability accommodation services as well as government-operated services.
Who has the obligation to report?
Once again, the head of agency, so it's modelled quite closely on the reportable conduct scheme. Can I also say, one of the strong advocates for this new system has been National Disability Services. So there's been very strong acceptance from the disability service sector, and also, of course, hardly surprising, also from the advocacy bodies. Now we keep waiting for somebody to express concern about the system, but it's very encouraging for me to say there's a great deal of support for it.
What features are there of the disability scheme that are not in the reportable conduct scheme but you think would strengthen the reportable conduct scheme?
I think in New South Wales, whether it's via the reportable conduct scheme or via another process, we need to have a good understanding of serious client-on-client incidents. And the next question is, well, what should be the process to give effect to that? It is a different issue. I noted the evidence given yesterday and agree with it, that there are issues pertaining to serious client-on-client matters that belong in the criminal justice system. But they're also, it's very important to recognise that there are also very much issues pertaining to good behaviour support and good casework practice, the notion of therapeutic work.
But you would receive allegations of peer-to-peer or child-on-child abuse in out-of-home care if it amounted to a serious assault, for example, wouldn't you?
The line of sight that we have via the reportable conduct scheme in terms of client-on-client abuse via the reportable conduct scheme is in connection with neglect. And so if there is a allegation or a reasonable inference that can be drawn that a child was sexually abused or the subject of sexual harassment as a result of neglect on behalf of the carer, and of course our guidelines raise the bar in terms of the definition. You know, an element of culpability, a suggestion of culpability, then we'll receive the notification. Now that does constitute a significant percentage of reportable conduct matters. About 9% of the out-of-home care reportable conduct matters are in the neglect area. What's interesting about that, and perhaps not surprising, is that the sustained finding, so that the finding that the carer has failed in their duty is about 42%.
Would you take the view that an allegation of sexual abuse or sexual conduct by a child on a child necessarily reflects a lack of supervision and therefore would fit the definition of neglect?
No.
Why not?
Well, I think there has to be some information to indicate unacceptable inaction by the carer. There will be circumstances where that kind of conduct can take place, and the carer quite reasonably had no knowledge. The other thing that's...
Sorry, just let me stop you there on that point. The carer in a home-based foster care situation would be the person responsible under the reportable conduct to report. Is that right?
No, in those circumstances, it would be the head of agency, so the carer in that foster care situation will be linked to an agency. And
so the carer, let's assume for the moment the carer is the only person in the home-based care. It would need the carer to have identified the conduct and to have reported it to the agency, and the agency formed the view that it indicated some form of neglect in respect of the child.
That's correct. One would think, though, if a child has been sexually abused or there's been police involvement of any type, it would be a poor out-of-home care service that would not be aware of that, and we would expect the out-of-home care service then to turn its mind to the question as to whether there has been care and neglect. Can I make the point on this, though? If one sees that the only way into examining these issues of child sexual abuse is under the umbrella of whether or not there's been care and neglect, I think that's not a good basis to look at this issue. And so my view would be, and I think it goes back to my earlier comments, I think serious child-on-child abuse matters, there needs to be a system, and I note that Victoria has a system that operates within the department. I think it's called Category 1 matters. There needs to be a system that ensures that those matters are examined. And just one final point on this. I also think there needs to be a system in New South Wales that encourages agencies, out-of-home care agencies, when there are placements where a child's welfare and well-being is not being appropriately supported, that it's good practice, it's seen as good practice by agencies to out themselves, and I would like to see this potentially operating at the district level. So an agency, for example, it might be a child in residential care, and you've got potentially a dangerous, unacceptable situation in play, or alternatively, you've got no guarantee that the children's welfare is being maintained. It would be a good situation then for agencies to feel comfortable to bring before a panel of experts these cases on a systematic basis to share the challenges that they're facing, so that at one end of the spectrum we can look at the question as to whether via support these children's rights can be protected and supported. At one end of the spectrum, true, at the other end of the spectrum to look at whether the placement is incompatible with the human rights of those children, and therefore placement changes need to be made.
Let's just leave the panel of experts for the moment and go back to the first point. What would the system look like, do you think, that had serious child-to-child sexual abuse come to the attention of the state and be dealt with?
Well, obviously one would need some guidelines, and a starting point could be the JERT criteria, together with, I'd suggest, a pattern of ongoing abuse. So you might not have a matter that meets the Joint Investigative Response Team criteria. It might be of a lower order, but where there's evidence of a pattern of abuse, and I'd also suggest as well serious unexplained injuries. And so agencies would be aware that if a matter of that type were to take place within a care situation, there would be a responsibility on them to bring it to the attention of an appropriate entity, and those matters then there'd be an expectation then that there'd be a review of the circumstances that took place, and of course if investigative action is taken, is required, because the matter may warrant a criminal action, that appropriate action is taken. But in addition, a very strong emphasis on the issues of behaviour management, a solid case practice, looking at the issue of child-centred analysis as to the circumstances and what's required in terms of the child or children in that placement.
Who's the appropriate entity? I'm happy for you, Mr Kinman, to take this broader issue on notice. As you know, there's going to be a consultation paper in due course published, and perhaps you might, in fact, the entire panel might wish to think about the issues Mr Kinman's raised and give considered thought to them, and perhaps respond by way of a submission to the consultation paper.
Thank you.
The same probably arises in relation to your expert panel. There's a lot that might be said now about that panel, but subject to the evidence you want to give now, Mr Kinman, that might also be a matter that's best the subject of thought and a submission.
Thank you.
Unless there is anything more you'd like to say now about it.
No.
Just turning back to the data, you've told us the number of notifications in the area of sexual misconduct and sexual offence within and out of the out-of-home care sector. What were the findings made in respect of those notifications?
If we look, for example, at the period 1st of July 2011 to 30th of June 2014, in connection with sexual misconduct and sexual offence matters, 15% of those matters were sustained, and a further 15% were deemed to be not sustained on the basis of insufficient evidence. Now, one might say, well, Mr Kinman, why would you draw attention to not sustained on the basis of insufficient evidence? The reason why is because that determination is a determination where one can't be confident one way or the other whether the conduct took place.
We wouldn't ask you that, Mr Kinman, but I'm glad you answered it.
Thank you. And so that's very important, because we would be looking in those cases to see that there were good, sophisticated risk management strategies in place. Because this isn't just about whether a charge is laid, whether somebody is removed from caring. This is about ensuring that appropriate and justifiable safeguards are in place in relation to the effect of children. What is interesting is that if you look at the sustained finding now in terms of sexual misconduct, sexual offence findings in the out-of-home care area, which is at 15%, it is less than the overall sustained finding across all sectors. So, for example, the sustained finding in relation to sexual misconduct, sexual offence matters in relation to all matters is at 25%. And so that highlights, I think, the need to ensure that there is there's rigour in relation to sexual assault, sexual misconduct matters in an out-of-home care setting. It probably also highlights the challenges.
Doesn't it indicate as well the closed nature of a foster care agency? Probably few witnesses, whereas in other areas, including education, there's a lot of people around and there may well be more evidence, circumstantial or otherwise, that the misconduct occurred.
Yes, that's correct. That is correct. And look, I'm very confident of the level of rigour that we apply to these matters. I have a number of principal investigation officers, and the individual who provides the lead in relation to the out-of-home care files is a very experienced operator, and she will pursue lines of inquiry if she's not satisfied. And so it's a troubling figure, the lower rate of sustained findings. And I think you're right, it does reflect the fact that this is happening within a home environment, and so it can be more challenging.
It's the case too, I think, from your figures that the not sustained percentage in relation to out-of-home care is 57%, whereas the not sustained across the board in relation to sexual misconduct is only 37%.
That's right.
That's reflective of similar matters to which we've been discussing.
I agree.
So, Mr Kinman, the sustained, the use of that language, are we to understand that this is your agency's finding?
That is in relation, if one finds sexual offence, for example, my rule of thumb with with my staff is if you're going to find that somebody is engaged in a sexual offence and in the absence of a criminal conviction, then one ought to have very solid grounds. Now, there will be occasions. There will be occasions, for example, where for one reason or another, the matter doesn't proceed to court, notwithstanding that there may be an admission. Now, it's rare, and of course, so generally speaking, when we're talking about a sustained finding in terms of sexual offence, we're talking about there having been a charge and conviction.
Your Honour, I know the time.
Yes, we'll take the mid-morning break now for 20 minutes. Thank you.